Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Songwriters on Process podcast. My name is Benno Papari, and since 2010, I've run the Songwriters on Process website, where you can find more than 200 conversations with songwriters about the creative process. I'm not here to talk about tour stories, band drama, how a band got its name, or favorite foods. My goal is to treat songwriters as writers, plain and simple. This is an intelligent conversation about the writing process between two writers. And today's interview is with Craig Finn of The Hold Steady. Finn has a new solo album out called A Legacy of Rentals, and this is the second time I've interviewed him. The first time was, I believe, around 10 or 11 years ago. And we touched upon a few topics today that I found really interesting. And, I think this is the kind of interview that applies to all creatives, not just songwriters. There's so much in this conversation that's about creativity in general. We talked this time and last time about the influence that exercise has on both of our writing processes. Finn, both of us are big runners, and we talked about this last time. And I wrote an article in the Washington Post about 5 or 6 years ago, I think, about the impact that exercise has on creativity and executive function. And I interviewed Finn for that story because he uses exercise as a way, as actually a part of his creative process. But he's also very ritualistic. I guess that's certainly a ritual, but he's also very ritualistic. And he certainly sees, he tries to keep traditional hours, and he likes to see being an artist as a real job. And he says that he likes to make appointments with himself to take things in. Taking things in is a big thing. Speaking of taking things in, this is one thing I've never heard before. He is reading Moby Dick. Now, I love talking about reading with songwriters, but no songwriter has ever told me they've read or are reading Moby Dick. And that got me thinking how very few of them have told me about just plain old reading the classics. Yeah, a lot of them have read, Vonnegut and Bukowski and people like that, but the classics, from old, the Moby Dick. So he actually said to me, if the next album is about whaling, you'll know where that came from. He writes quickly. He said he writes rapid fire 4 stanzas in about 90 minutes, then plays it to see if he wants to change anything. And he starts by figuring out what he likes the least in that song and then attacking it from there. And they'll set it aside for about a week and then come back to it. But a lot of it is about the ritual. But the part to me that I found most interesting in this interview was we talked a lot about memory, the idea of memory retrieval, how we remember things, why we remember certain things. And there's a story he tells in this interview about staring at a picture of, I think, his high school or college buddies. And he said that when he first started looking at the picture, someone gave it to him. It was like 30 people in this picture. And someone gave it to him, and he said right off the bat, he remembered 8 people immediately, remember their names. But the more he stared at it, for a long time, minutes, and I forgot how long he said, the more the names came to him as he just stared longer and longer. And reminded me of an interview I did with David Bazan, and I mentioned this in the interview about David Bazan. For one of his albums, he would drive around his old childhood neighborhood, and as he drove around, and he remembered things as he saw things, and that brought up more memories. So the very existential idea of memory was a big part of this. And like I said, it wasn't a psychological treatment of retrieval or anything like that, but why we remember certain things and what we remember, how we remember, ideas of loss. And I mentioned one author in this interview, Anthony Doerr, and his book Memory Wall addresses the idea of memory. Doerr wrote the book All the Light We Cannot See, which won the Pulitzer Prize. But Anthony Doerr, and that's Doerr, writes a lot about memories, a fantastic novelist, and his book Memory Wall touches on that. So again, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, just talking to someone about creativity and memory and ritual in the process. And I'm, of course, a big Hold Steady fan, so this was a lot of fun. And, come for the ideas about creativity and stay for the thoughts on the running tips. And anyway, so with that, my interview with Craig Finn of The Hold Steady. I guess my first question is, since you said, you just told me you have spent some time up in upstate New York. Do you ever do any writing up there, or is that just kind of the
I kind of
producing
write,
end of it?
I guess I kind of write everywhere. I kind of just write wherever I am. So I'm sure I know I've written stuff up there. But more and more, especially as I get a little older, um, you know, uh, so much of it happens just in the 9 to 5, like the like sitting down at the desk and working, and I'm sitting at my desk right now. And I get, I keep pretty much like business hours, so to speak. I think like, one of the things that some years ago, uh, reading or learning about, Nick Cave putting on a suit and going to his office every day, it inspires me and really kind of something I relate to. I don't put on a suit, but um, I do think like it makes me, and I wonder like when I don't really come from an artistic family, and I wonder, I've kind of like self-analyzed myself recently, whether that is a way to make it feel like, I have a quote unquote real job to myself. Because I do believe being an artist is a real job, but like I wonder if there's some way of making that feel a certain way to myself, by keeping very traditional hours.
Yeah. So before we get to that ritual, I'm curious if you ever notice if the song lyrics, the music themselves, if it does ever change based on where you are, because some songwriters do tell me that when they are in a more natural or forested environment, the music or the lyrics change based on where they are versus when you're surrounded by noise, in Brooklyn.
That's a good question. I don't know that I've ever felt that. I think I can get to a pretty peaceful place here in my office. But there is stuff like when you're like, like you may see something on a sign, a street sign or a town name or whatever, or a certain chapel, or that no matter what kind of travel you're doing does make it into the songs. I think signs in particular are really interesting to me. I love being in like, back when we tour more in a van, like being in the passenger side and seeing things fly by you. I think was a heightening creative experience for me. I don't know if it ever made a song, but I remember being in Redding, California, and I was actually on a run. We talked about running before, but I ran by this kind of decrepit looking motel, and it had a bar attached, and in the bar window, in a handwritten sign, it said, "Where rumors become legends." And
Nice.
it was like, wow. I wanted to go in, but I didn't have any money on me. I was running, so I just had to take a look at the sign, but I think about that sign often.
Yeah. So do you still write? I remember looking at our interview we did 10 years ago. You said you believed in writing in some form every day, even if it's not good. Do you still adhere? Sounds like you still adhere to that.
Yeah, most days I'll just put something down, like like right now I'm in a like kind of a promo period, as the record's coming out. So sometimes it's like, we need this, we need you to write about this. And that might be the writing I do that day. But as long as I'm doing something each day, yeah. And then reading every day too. That's something, Jeff Tweedy wrote a book, and he talks a lot about creativity in that, and his views on it I really understood, and one of the things was taking things in.
Yeah.
So I kind of make appointments with myself to like make sure I'm taking things in. Like every year I during Lent, which is right now, I quit drinking because I'm a lapsed Catholic, but that part is still pretty active. Like it's got enough levity that I actually follow through, and I've been doing it for years and years. This one I've added. I'm reading Moby Dick, and I've never read
Wow.
it before, so that's amazing. By the way, yeah, have you read
Yeah.
Moby Dick?
I
Yeah.
did. I had to read it for my PhD comprehensive exams. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing, and no one tells you no one told me how funny it is.
Yeah.
So I've really been enjoying that. But yeah, that's like taking things in. So maybe if the next record's all about whaling, you'll know where it came.
Well, Well, no. So we'll talk about the reading later, because I want to talk about that, of course. But the rituals, I mean, I'm a very ritualistic person when it comes to my writing as well. Like for me, I never write and revise in the same room. I'll always go to a different room because I just don't want to be, those things are so separate to me.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure that they're separated because, when you start looking at something too often, it just loses it. Your eyes start to glaze over. So but I'm very much like you are. I can only write in the morning. I'm not a late night person. And I do have that favorite chair I like to write in. But songwriters are pretty divided about that. I mean, some of them tell me like, no, I can't have a ritual. But why is that? Is it a confidence thing? I mean, why does it make you so productive?
Again, as a raised Catholic, I think I have to have ritual. It has to, anything important has to have a ritual, I definitely do the like writing quick kind of, and then editing, painstakingly editing. That's more, like getting something down on the page and then shaping it into something I like is a big part of the process. Ritual, I think as long as I do like the daily stuff, it falls into line, like I am like you, it needs to happen in the morning. I usually like walk the dog and then just start crushing coffee and writing something, and then editing can happen just later. You know what I mean? Like it's not, I don't need to do it in a different room like you do or anything. We're a little space challenged because we live in Brooklyn. Everything kind of has to happen in this room. But I come back to it. Is the point. And as I sort of, because I still make albums. As I sort of circle the songs of this is the album, I'll start going through them, and I'll even start going through them kind of rapid fire. Like I'm going to like play through this one song once and see if I want to change anything, but then I'm going to move on to the next song. And as the album, the recording draws closer, I'll start doing that kind of rapid fire thing. And then that process, you might end up changing one word. But it's sort of just this last, touching up part of the process.
So when you say you write quickly, is it almost like a free write type where you're just not really thinking about what's on the page, or do you give yourself a certain amount of time and write as much as you can?
Yeah. Like, I'll write a lot. Like, I'll write, try to get, 4 stanzas would be like the minimum, right? So that's like 16 lines. That would be the minimum, but mainly more like 24 or 30. And then that would be in like 90 minutes. Right. And then, just on average, and then go back and start throwing stuff out, and moving stuff around and changing it. And then, I do this process where I kind of like, I say, what's the line I like the least? And then make it better. And then I say, now what's the line I like the least, and you keep moving those, you keep attacking the limping antelope of the herd, so to speak. And you keep making it better. And I may have said this when we talked before, but I had like a real creative sort of breakthrough. A friend of mine had worked on the Letterman show, and he talked about, he's like, we have to write a show. The show's going on at 11 p.m. or whenever it comes on. We have to write a show. Then we work on making it good. And so, I really think that's the truth. You got to write a song, and then you got to work on it till it's a good song.
So do you, is the distance intentional? Like for me, the worst time to revise is after I've written or revised. So do you intentionally say, okay, it's done, I'll set it aside and then come back to it?
Absolutely. And, there's no real set period, but I would say at least a week.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Cause I'm always writing. So like, you don't have to worry about editing unless something's coming up, you have an opportunity to play a new song, or you want to make a record, then you have to start circling the wagons and editing. But, it can go, I can leave it alone for quite a while. And I think that helps. That that distance also helps me, like if it's even something I want to pursue.
Yeah.
Because if I'm writing a lot, you choose like, well, this one's speaking to me today, so let's work on it. And that was actually, that was, speaking of which, that was the hardest thing about the pandemic, is that I wrote a ton, but somehow with the absence of the rest of my normal life, I had a harder time judging whether I liked what I'd written or not. I was kind of like just making a pile, and not when I went back to it, it was more difficult for me to be like, this is better than this, etc.
Yeah. I just read an article in the Wall Street Journal literally this weekend about creativity and kind of what they found. I guess there's some research coming out about how creatives create. And I interviewed Daniel Lanois, this is like a year ago, and he said he puts all of his songs on, I think he said 11 by 22 art paper. And there's thought bubbles and arrows and lines everywhere, just stuff all over the place, like completely nonlinear. And the research I think that this article discusses is that idea. And they even referenced Hemingway in the article. It said, there really is truth to the write drunk, edit sober thing, is that the most creative people are those who don't think about it in a linear fashion at all. And so I'm curious how that, I guess what your thoughts are on that, about how linear the creative process should be.
Yeah, I mean, if you can get out of that, I think that's generally better. I mean, in my own process, I might, there's a second part of it that when I bring songs, since 2014, I've been making music with Josh Kaufman, producing, and, he'll pull out, I'll show him stuff where I don't have like a chorus yet, and he'll be like, well, that line right there is strong, so let's take that out of the verse and make a chorus around it, and allowing yourself to go there. I think it's frustrating, and there's just like there's a sense of, I don't know, and with musicians, demoitis, right? Like you once you demo it, you can't get away from that. And I think that learning to go on a journey with each song is rewarding, and I think important, and a better way to do it, a better way to approach things, because I think a lot of musicians hear stuff in their head, and to just march right at that over a career, that can get limiting, because you're constantly bringing only one point of view to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you, the other, well, I was going to actually talk about deadlines, because you mentioned this. You mentioned with your friend who's a Letterman writer, and I create false deadlines for myself. So I do a lot of travel for work, and I go to New York a lot. And what I'll do is a false deadline to me isn't, I'll write for an hour. How much can I write? A false deadline is I have a hard stop. And I found that I would get 5 times more done on that 3-hour train from DC to New York, because I have to put my laptop away. But if you told me to write for 3 hours now and there's no reason to stop, I wouldn't get anything done. Yeah. And is that, and I find that to be a really effective tool. If we're like, my wife says, we have to be somewhere in an hour, that's a great time for me to write.
Yeah. All that anything you can kind of enforce a rule on yourself. And it might be like, I'm going to write 10 songs this week, or I'm going to write a song every day. I've done that many times, like a 30-day personal challenge, where finish things, or try to get things more finished than normal. Any of that stuff is good. And I am a calendar guy, I put like things on the calendar, which might be like, write 10,000 words on this topic, whatever. And just to keep keep an eye on it, and, but I totally agree. I mean, I think when we're busy, we're at our best.
But you can do that. You could even say like, I couldn't do that. I couldn't, if there's no reason to really finish something because I have to stop, but you have the discipline to say, I'll write 1,000 words a day. Even if you didn't write 1,000 words a day, nothing's really going to happen, right? But sounds like you can actually do that. That's impressive.
Yeah, I can do that, but you know, I can definitely do that. There's like I can make myself do that. But again, that's sort of part of the punch in the clock,
Yeah.
um and treating it like, like having a to-do list that you religiously cross things off on, and you feel a little bit of dopamine when you do,
Yeah.
like you say, like, I did it, and I'm going to do the next thing. And there is this sense, at least especially now that I'm older, that these things, like, they turn into things, you're
Yeah.
like, I'm going to sit down and write a bunch of songs. And then here you are 2 years later and you have this album coming out and you're like, that only is happening because I like sat down at the desk and did it,
Yeah. Yeah.
even on days I didn't want to.
Yeah. So one more thing I read about recently, and this was a study about the moments right before you fall asleep. It's not when you're sleeping. There's this moment right between like full on slumber, like this hate. There's a term for it. I always forget to look up what the term is, but the study referenced Salvador Dali and how he had this thing where he would sit in a very uncomfortable chair with a skeleton key in his hand and with a like a saucer on the floor underneath the key. And so when he would fall asleep, the key would fall out of his hand. It would make a noise. He'd wake up and then create. And yeah, but there's actually they've actually done this. They've replicated this to some extent in the lab without the key and the saucer. And what they found was that's a very fruitful time. So I'm curious if that ever happens to you in those moments of maybe not just sleep, but in that period right before when you get these lyrics or musical ideas.
Every once in a while, and I like will be in bed and like something will come up, and I'll immediately jot it down on my phone because I don't trust myself to remember. But more than anything, I am not a night person, and my girlfriend, my partner Angie, she actually is like always a little bit shaking her fist at me at how easily I fall asleep. So I don't spend a lot of time like, looking at the ceiling and thinking. So that, I think my version of that might be when I wake up and start writing and drinking coffee.
Yeah. 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 Okay. So the new album I've listened to the new album. I love it. And I really like what you wrote about it kind of in the promo notes. And I'm curious, is it harder to write with great emotional weight? I mean, some people just, is it easy to write with heavy emotional weight? And I don't want to make this a pandemic question, but in general, do you find that to be a productive time, or is it just at some point, does it become too difficult to write about things because it weighs on you too much, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what I would say is I do need a little distance from things before they make sense to me. A lot of the songs I wrote in this for this record were written in the pandemic, but there were a lot of songs. And so like the ones I chose were the ones that kind of made sense of the experience or made sense to where I was at a year later, I think it's good to write. I have another friend who's a writer, and he says, write at it, write at it. And I think that's probably a good way to go. I mean, I don't think I wanted, you don't like to try to figure out how you're feeling. In some way, maybe it's like, okay, I'm going to write a story. And then you realize you're writing about someone who's ill, and it's not, even if it's fiction and it's happened in the 1800s, all of a sudden you're like, wow, the pandemic is creeping into my brain. And that's interesting. That's an interesting when you start, and then you write, 20 more songs and they all feature someone who's ailing in some way. You're like, oh, I think I know what this is about. So, it's that, Joan Didion will write to find out what we're thinking or whatever that is. I think that's very much true. And I don't think you want to, I wouldn't want to write about, I wouldn't write a song about Donald Trump or the election or something like that. But the heaviness of those years may very much find themselves into the way people struggle, inequality, things like that you might be thinking of in a smaller scale.
Yeah. Is it practically though, I guess when those feelings are overtaking you, is it difficult to write in those times? I mean, I've had some songwriters tell me, yeah, I mean, it's hard to write when you're depressed, when you're just, I mean, at some point it's just difficult to sit down, but because there are some pretty heavy topics, obviously, you wrote about this new album. So
Yeah, I mean, I think in that, a lot of these songs were written during the pandemic, and I was actually like I said earlier, my partner's a nurse. I was displaced.
yeah,
I had to move in with her sister's family, and there was a little room there, and I would go in there and write a song every day. And I thought, like, well, I'm here, like a lot of things seem shut down. Like I've got the time,
yeah,
and so that's what came out. But I was terrible. That was a very scary time. Obviously, Angie was in going into, something that was heavy each day, and there were sirens all around. But like there was also, that was maybe a time each day that I felt okay too, I mean,
yeah.
that I was sort of, again, hitting the ritual that I've done in better times too. So there was like, well, I know what I'm going to do with this 2 hours. The rest of the day is kind of weird, but so in some ways it's a break. It's if you're committed to it. But I get it. I mean, if you're depressed, it's hard to do anything,
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that mind state is like I I've said for years, but I think like one of the greatest times to write is unfortunately is being hungover.
Yeah, I read that you said that, and why is that? Please, because you're ever since you told me this, so many songwriters have told me that, and I don't buy. I don't see how that's possible because just the pain factor. But my God, I'd love to explore what it is.
Something about a hangover brings a dark comedy out. It's a dark humor because you've done it to yourself. So there's a little bit like of a self-loathing, but everything's a little weirdly funnier. And there's a defeatist attitude that sort of comes through that, like, you've defeated yourself. I've done it to myself again. And but it usually comes, you probably are that, hopefully it's because you went to a wedding and it was really fun and you had too many drinks, you had one or two too many. And it's not because you just stayed up watching TV and drank a bottle of whiskey. So I think it comes from after a period of elation. So I think that's why for me, but I don't know. I think depression can be useful. I think figuring out, pushing through depression is really, in my case, the only way I've found to fight it, and with exercise and etc. But I think it's probably easier, or I mean, I think it's probably good that whatever's in your mind, to get it on the page. I think, speaking of Joe Diddy, and I think her husband was John Gregory Dunn, right?
Yeah.
Is his name right? Yeah. So he said the first character in every novel is the writer, is the author. And I think that's very good. I mean, like you can sit down to write a story about, an astronaut going on to the moon, and it's going to be something about you, like your own depression, your own anxiety might very well find itself into that person.
When you write about, I know this album is also, you talk writing about memory, and it reminds me of when I think I interviewed David Bazan. This was 5, 6, 7 years ago, I think. And he wrote an album, I think, about someplace he grew up in, where he grew up as a child. And I think he actually drove those streets. And when he drove those streets, they got him thinking about things to write about. So when you're writing about memories, are there things that you draw on, tricks that you use, kind of put yourself back in that space?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the songs in this were, about memory and how we remember people, and how we kind of pay tribute to people and places that are gone. And so I think, like, it was important to me to think about, like, how we really do tell these stories, how, like, because the stories, by telling the stories, they kind of replace the memory, right? Like the legend becomes the thing, and what we put in and what we leave out often can be like a very cleaned up version, So trying to do that, I think, because of we're kind of homebound during this record, I don't know that I've driven the streets, but I do that, especially when I get back to Minneapolis. I'll drive around and see
Yeah.
what's there and see what's changed. And just thinking about, like even sketching out like what, certain things, how they were important, but I think, putting details into things really help. Like details kind of can spur those memories, right? Like it's like, what where you went to get coffee with that person, rather than, that can be like, that can tell the story in itself.
We live in the same neighborhood I grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm a big runner, and there are times now we'll run by a house that I've run by 5,000 times. And somehow after 5,000 times, I run by the house and I remember, oh my gosh, that's the bush I fell in during a party in 12th grade. Sure. I don't know. And it's fascinating to me that it never has occurred to me in the other 4,999 times I've run by that bush. And that, to me, I find that interesting, that was a big memory. You drive by those places and somehow that memory comes up that you never had before.
Yeah. I mean, I had this recent, a friend of mine forwarded a picture of people we went to school with. I went to Boston College, and there was a picture of like 30 guys, classic college shot, guys drinking beer out, and there's a porch and everyone's out there. I wasn't in the photo, but I knew all these guys at one point. And at my first view, I think I could name 8 of them out of 30. And I just kept staring at it. And over 30 minutes, names started just popping back up. And like, it was a physical relationship between how long I looked at it, and what came back. And I think that was like kind of moving to me and made me realize like that's an exercise I should be able to repeat somehow. Like I should remember that, because there are things that, if you just stare at a photo of a house in your neighborhood, maybe things like that, like you said, will come back. And I do that. There's also this thing about getting older that's really, I mean, everyone experiences, but like I've lived in New York for 21 years now, and I'm old enough in New York now, which is crazy because I still don't feel like a New Yorker, but to experience everything as what it used to be.
Yeah.
That used to be a dry cleaner. That used to be a cool bar. That used to be, and there's this constant ghost, like, behind every storefront, and oh, so-and-so used to live in that building, so once you're in one place, there's always those things kind of coming back at you into your everyday.
That's interesting to say that, because there's a place where my friends I used to hang out, and I knew that they were tearing it down. And at some point I would drive by or walk by to run by it every day to make sure the memory stays in my mind. And I always wondered at some point, I'm not going to remember how many times am I going to go by that place after it's gone and say, yeah, I don't remember, I don't remember what it's, I don't know. I find that fascinating but I was doing this conscious, like, let me soak it in as much as I can, because at some point I'm going to walk by there. I'm going to say, God, what was there?
One of the things I connect that, like, really, like on 3rd Avenue and I think it's 16th Street. There used to be this pizza place, Mary Ellis. And when I first moved to New York, I had this job. It was over there. And me and my 2 friends from that job would go there at lunch. And the pizza was great. It was my favorite pizza in New York. And it had late, I'd say mid, must have been maybe 8 years ago. I might be getting this wrong again. Time collapses. They had a fire, and it was suddenly just gone, and they didn't reopen. And it was like a mom and pop place. So it wasn't like you could go to the other location. It was just like that, and that's a very taste and memory are so connected. So like, you're like, I wish I could have that again, but it's not like we knew the owner, even though we were in there all the time. Like it's just gone. Right.
Yeah.
And that's just like, no, you can say like, I could bring you to the best pizza, but I can't now. So, there's this thing that suddenly is ripped from your thing, and then you wonder, was it great? Was it really that great, or was I just in an exciting time in my life, and I made these new friends, and I think it was really that great. I turned my girlfriend onto it before it closed, but all the same, you have those things in your life that are just suddenly gone, and people are like that too, you know?
Yeah.
My friend Brian Dilworth died. We played in London March 8th. It's like 6, 7, 8, the year the pandemic started. So we were really right up against it. And on the plane ride home, I learned that Brian had passed away. He's a year older than me, and pulmonary embolism, just died quickly. And it was, that it's the same feeling. It's like, I'm not going to be able to talk about baseball with him. Like I'm not going to. And then, that I think that event more than anything started me thinking about how we remember people, and how we best remember people, and how we how we carry on those things and legends and stories and all that.
There's a great book by Anthony Doerr. Anthony Doerr wrote the novel All the Light We Cannot See, that won the Pulitzer Prize like 6 or 7 years ago. But his book before that is called Memory Wall, and it talks about a lot of the things it's a novel. It's fantastic. Memory Wall, Anthony Doerr, Doerr, but he talks a lot about that. So, all right, couple more questions. One, I found that in the pandemic, people have gotten, because, practically they're homebound. I'm always fascinated by the number of people have told me have gotten song ideas doing mundane activities, cleaning, vacuuming, washing dishes. Kebmo told me ironing was a great source of interest. I'd never heard ironing before. Folding clothes, he said. But it's something about the mundane activities that get you, inspired. So I'm curious how often that happens to you.
Well, walking, I mean, that may be a little less mundane than ironing, but just literally going on a walk, like running, running opens up my mind, and I still am a runner, although somehow during the pandemic I lost like some speed. I'm a little slower than I thought. Anyways, but running like opens up my mind and gets my mind to a place where I think I can, and it staves off depression. So it gets me, it helps me live my life. But walking, with no headphones, just, I think something about the pace of the rhythm, allows me. And again, you're walking by things. You're walking by that bush you're talking about. You're seeing the sign I'm talking about. You're like, taking in all this stuff. And I think, to me, walking is the greatest way to get song ideas. And for years I've been a walker on tour. I'm like the guy who just walks off and no one knows where he is. Cause that's what that helps me sort of interact with the world, like emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, whatever.
Do you use that deliberately for song ideas? Like for me, when I run, there's a certain comfort. If I'm in a rut when I'm writing, I will go for a run. And so I use that deliberately. So do you use it ever deliberately?
Yeah. To two things I use deliberately. Well, walking would be one. And then again, taking things in, like just sitting down and saying, like, I'm not writing that well. I'm going to read. I'm going to read a lot this week, or I'm going to watch a film, watch a movie. I have a list of movies that I should have seen, but I haven't seen. Like, I'm just going to check one of those off and see how it inspires me,
Yeah. Do you, so you might be walking and all of a sudden a line might come to you.
Oh yeah. All the time. And, sometimes there's also like that thing where it's like a crossword puzzle. I like doing crossword puzzles. Sometimes like you walk away from it, or you can't get it. And then later that day you're like, oh, and like you get that long one at the bottom and it just fills in the rest of the puzzle. So that can happen from walking. That can also just happen from revisiting things later. But those are very real for me.
See, that's why when you said looking at that picture, that's what I thought you were going to say, because the picture, I feel like if you look at the picture an hour later, something's going to come to you that wouldn't come to you if you were just staring at it.
Yeah, that
And
would be my normal, but staring at it in this case was weirdly like
oh, really?
things were like literally popping up.
Yeah, there was a great article in the New Yorker. It must have been 10 years ago. I think it was Louis Menand. I think he's the one that writes about the writing process for the New Yorker.
Mhm.
And he has this thing where when he's ever struggling with something he's writing, he puts ideas on. I'm going to get the story. I think this is correct, on a bunch of note cards on a table in the entryway. And what he does, it's a table he walks by 50 times a day at least. Every time he walks by, he'll look at it. Most of the time, nothing will come. But sometimes he'll walk by, it might be the 38th time, and that something will come to him that he wouldn't have come to if he just stared at it. But that I thought that was so interesting. That's how he writes. That kind of like returning to things is a way to.
I get that. The other thing is that more and more collaboration, not so much in the early part, but like I said, like bringing it to Josh, bringing it to producer you trust and him being like, that part's great, and that part excites me less, and being like, you might fight him on it. You might say, no, the first part's the genius part, but you might just say like, I appreciate that insight. Let's go there. Yeah. And then it goes to a third place by the two of you putting your heads together. And that is, if you're with the right people, that's a journey worth going on.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So you mentioned Moby Dick. So I feel like we should close with, So well, but still, no one. This is the first songwriter who's ever told me, that they have read Moby Dick or reading Moby Dick. I know you're a big reader, so first of all, what made you pick up Moby Dick? That's my first question.
Well, two things. One, it seems like something you should have read, right? Like that's a lot of people have read it. But number two, well, three things. Number two is it feels like, because of the content of, like we say that in almost our vernacular, like it's my white whale. It's my, it's like an epic. It's an epic. It's shorthand for an epic. Right. So it seems like something to tackle. But a friend of mine was just saying like, it's so fucking good. And it's really funny. And that's something I'd never heard about Moby Dick, that it was funny. And I know like, some things I like Pynchon and like really, like there's some like nods to Moby Dick and, the sea shanties and things like that. So, but what I found is exactly what Joey said. It's funny. There's a little bit of that, like, over dramatic almost. There's some part of that feels like a Morrissey lyric, it's like, oh, such is boyhood, there's some of that I really get off on. I think that's hilarious.
That's so interesting. I can't say I'm going to go back and reread the book, but it reminds me of when I first read Vonnegut, and it was I read Slaughterhouse-Five the first time and I read it, and it was so dark. And there were times when I thought, am I supposed to be laughing at this? Like, I almost had to look it up. I think I may have looked it up on the internet and see if people called it a comedy, because at some point I said, oh, yes, this is dark, but it's also hilarious. Like, he is writing these lines to be humorous.
Well, I think that I had that same thing. And, I made a record, Boys and Girls in America, that references On the Road. But, I read like any good countercultural 16-year-old, I read On the Road, and I didn't really get it. And then I read it again in my 30s, and I was like, oh, this is very funny. Yeah. It's very, I didn't understand it. And I think, you bring different perspectives to these things, but I think like, different things are funny, and dark comedy especially can kind of pass under the radar if you're not in the right place the first time.
Definitely. So do you have a reading list, or the things like what's next after? Are you going through the classics, or what are you doing exactly?
No. I mean, like I'm reading that Moby Dick slowly. Like I have like it's sort of part of my morning ritual. I read a chapter or two, and it's gonna be a slow burn. I just read John Darnielle's book. I don't know if he's been on your show.
I've not. Yeah, he has. I did interview him a few years ago, but yeah,
and the book is great.
Really,
Double House, and actually does actually spark some of my other things about memory, the way, and storytelling, the way I'm. So I have to get what he's friend. I'm friendly with him. I don't know. This is someone gave me this, and that's what I'm reading. Just started last night, but I've always got something that I'm reading, and it's either novels or rock bios. I like when I'm touring, it's hard to read something too weighty. So a rock and roll bio is just like perfect for when you're moving around quick because
Right.
you somehow relate.
I was never a more than one book at a time person, but then someone I interviewed said that they read like 3 books at a time, and that changed my reading habits entirely. So I will read a novel. I can't read 2 novels at the same time. That's too heavy.
That makes sense.
Yeah. It's got to be a novel and maybe like a rock bio or some nonfiction piece. Cause I find that when I'm reading one, the other one's kind of stewing around in my mind.
Yeah.
And
I think I put the New York version of me, I put the rock bio on my phone. So if I'm on the subway, that's easy, light reading that you don't mind if someone's breathing on you while you're doing it. Where Moby Dick need a little alone time,
Yeah. The Modern Library Association put out the best. It was the 100 best novels of the 20th century English language. So if you do need the list of the classics,
okay,
that's up there. Now they do have Ulysses at number 1. I'm not sure I could recommend. James Joyce is not exactly light reading, especially, but all those books, I go through that list sometimes and it's like, oh, I've never read that book. That's what I'll read next.
Yeah, that's it's good to have. I have, those things. I have I'm a big notes guy in my phone. So I have a running list of anytime someone says a movie that sounds interesting, I put it in their book. So I have this huge list that I work my way through. The Notes app has really replaced, speaking of memory, has helped me a lot as I turn 50. It's I try to get everything in there because it's not what it used to be.
And that's it for the latest episode of Songwriters on Process. Don't forget, you can find all of my interviews with over 200 songwriters on my Songwriters on Process website at songwritersonprocess.com, going all the way back to 2010. You can read them, watch them, or listen to them. So until next time, thanks for listening.